Good evening. So good to see you all again. Welcome to the this year's Budget and Revenue Task Force meeting. There are a few new faces here, although most of us have been around this table on pretty much an annual basis or several times a year. So it's been suggested that we just go around quickly, introduce ourselves and our roles, and then we'll get into the agenda that's in front of you. So I think I know just about all of you. I'm Joe Curo. I'm the chair of the Board of Selectmen.
Adam Chapdelaine, Town Manager.
Sandy Pooler, Deputy Town Manager.
Jeff Thielman, School Committee.
Dean Carmen, Town Treasurer.
Al Tosti, Finance Committee.
Dan Dunn, Selectmen. Paul Schlickman, School Committee.
Doug Hine, Town Council.
Charlie Foskett, Finance Committee.
Cindy Stark, School Committee.
John Denizio, School Department.
Cindy Fields, Controller's Office.
Jason Levy, President of the AEA.
Kathy Bodie, Superintendent.
Kirsty Allison-Ampe, School Committee.
Len Cardin, School Committee.
Cindy Friedman, State Senate.
Diane Mahan, what is currently known as the Board of Selectmen.
Board of Selectmen, briefly.
Bill Hayner, School Committee.
Marie Kropalka, Board Administrator for the Selectmen.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming on out. We're going to start off the agenda with a presentation on the town's long-range financial projection. I'm going to turn it over to the town manager and deputy town manager for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will give a brief overview and introduction, and then turn it over to Sandy to walk through the details of the long-range plan. What we really want to do tonight is really accomplish two things. One, provide an update on where we stand as we're in FY 18 and prepare for FY 19. But two, look forward in terms of how we're doing in our long-term outlook and what the future holds in terms of looking at future potential for an operating override and a high school debt exclusion, both which are being discussed as being necessary sooner than one might think. So to take a quick step back for everyone's benefit, the Budget and Revenue Task Force was formed probably well better than a decade ago, as Arlington started to talk about this idea of a long-term override. Question? No, oh, sorry. A long-term override that would last more than for the year that the override was asked for. And the idea was to bring around everyone that's here tonight, stakeholders from a diverse group, people from our state legislative delegation, to really understand the town's long-term financial outlook. Generally, when we're in the midst of an override plan, the Budget and Revenue Task Force likely meets once a year. As we're starting to talk about planning for an override, the Budget and Revenue Task Force is a great forum to meet a little bit more regularly to talk through what the community wants to see and what the community thinks it can handle and what the leaders of the community want to propose in terms of an operating override, ultimately recommending up to the Board of Selectmen, who is the only body that can put an override question on the ballot. So that's the general context of the Budget and Revenue Task Force. In terms of our long-range financial outlook, Sandy will get into the detail of this, but what you'll see as we go through this plan is Arlington has a structural deficit. As we all know, we're 5.5 square miles. We're basically built out. We have very constrained new property tax growth, though we've done better in the past 2 years than we had done the few years before that coming out of the recession. We're still quite limited with our new growth as a percentage of our total tax base. So what happens is, with Proposition 2.5, adding on that new tax growth, our revenues don't keep pace with our expenses, especially not the expenses that we can't control, like our pension costs, our healthcare costs, and in more recent years, with the influx of more and more students into the school district, increasing school costs have grown at a proportion larger than what we can increase in revenue. So that's what creates our structural deficit, and that's why back in 2004, the town asked for and successfully received an override that was planned to last for 5 years, and then again in 2011 asked for an override that was planned to last for 3 years, but is now looking to last for 8 years to cover that structural deficit, to stabilize services, support services over the longer period instead of asking for things on a year-over-year basis. So I wanted to provide that context. But with that, I'll turn it over to Sandy to walk through the details of where we stand and where we think we're going to be in the future.
Hello, everybody. So what I'm going to refer to is this long sheet. Some of you have heard me talk about this recently, so I hope I am repeating myself because that means the numbers are right. As we go along, if you have a question, just raise your hand, let me know. But what I wanted to do is just give an overview of what our fundamental assumptions are in this plan for our revenues and our expenses going forward, and how they all balance out over time. So, ever since Proposition 2.5 was passed, we've changed from a world in which budgets were generated first by calculating expenses and then deciding how much revenue to raise, to flipping it on its head by calculating how much revenue we have and then figuring out expenses. That is true here in this plan. Our major sources of revenue, we start with state aid, and in general, the largest part of state aid comes from both Chapter 70, which is school aid, and unrestricted general government aid. School aid, for the last several years, has been limited to a minimum aid calculation. In other words, there's been a certain amount that's been put in the budget every year by the governor and the legislature to give us minimum aid. It's usually somewhere between $20 and $30 per student. In FY19, it actually went up some, so that we're getting what's called foundation aid. In other words, the state has to make up the difference between what it requires cities and towns to put into the school spending and what they figure on average it costs in Arlington to educate a student. And this year, the cost went up more than what the state calculated we needed to put in. So we got some foundation aid, which meant we got a little more aid than we had in the past. That was mostly, I think, due to how they've recalculated how you calculate the cost of health insurance for cities and towns, for educating, or for the teachers and other staff. So I think going forward, what we project is we continue to get about a 1% increase in aid, because we generally have been a minimum aid community. The other part of state aid that's big is UGA, Unrestricted General Government Aid, and ever since the Baker administration came in, they made a promise and have kept the promise to increase local aid in that category at the same percentage that aid is increasing for state revenue. And so for FY19, that number was 3.5%, and that's what's built into our UGA calculation. So state aid is generally going up a little more than 3%, which has been better than it has been in the last few years. The next line down there is just some old MSBA school construction aid that is exactly matched with some bonds that we're paying off. It will go away in a couple of years as we pay off those bonds, so they're a wash, dollar in, dollar out. Local receipts, as part of the Long-Range Planning Committee's long-term policy to increase local receipt estimates $100,000 a year, we again increase that amount. It isn't as much at the end of the year as we actually bring in local receipts, but that difference is a major part of where we bring in any free cash at the end of the year. So it's an important buffer and an important thing that helps create free cash. And speaking of free cash, the next item is how much free cash we're putting in the budget. Every year we look at the amount of free cash that is certified by the state, and you see it down in the bottom left-hand corner under the FY18 recap. Free cash was certified as $9,186,000. Half of that then goes into the FY19 budget. Going forward, we estimate what the 10-year average of free cash has been, and that has been $5.8 million, because there are some years we have a lot of free cash and some years we don't. And so going forward as a revenue source, we use half of that $5.8 million every year. Free cash is one of those things that we have to recreate every year. We have to have a gap between our estimates and our actuals in order to create free cash. And there's no guarantee that it's always going to be as high as it is, so it is always something that we have to take a look at. overlay reserve surplus, every year we put in a couple of $100,000. That's pretty steady, and it's frankly a very small part of the budget. The big thing I alluded to before is property taxes. Prop 2.5, the growth we have in Prop 2.5 every year is a 2.5% increase on the base plus whatever new growth we've had from year to year. The last 4 years, we've been averaging a little more than $1 million in new growth because we have had a lot of things like condo conversions. It's almost all generated out of the residential sector because, as Adam said, we don't have a big commercial and business sector in our tax base. And then going forward, we're assuming that that will be $650,000 in 2020, $600,000 in 2021, and so forth. With all these numbers, we look at what actually has come in from the previous year, make adjustments, so that originally, when we were looking at 2019, we thought that there'd be $650,000 worth of new growth. When $1 million came in, we put it into the plan, so the current year that we're working on always reflects the actual from whatever was certified by the assessors for the current tax year. And then the override stabilization fund, $3,298,000. This is the fund that we've put money into for several years running since the last override. And this is the first year in all those years that we've taken money out. And you'll see going forward, in FY20, we look to take out $8.5 million. In FY21, $11.4 million. And it's $11.4 million in FY21 because that's all that will be left in the piggy bank at that point. It will be gone. It gives us $158 million to spend. And then how do we spend it? First, let me ask if there are any questions about the revenue first before I go on to spending. All right, spending, that's the fun part, right?
And can I just acknowledge that Representative Dave Rogers has joined us?
Thank you. Again, according to long-term policy from the Long-Term Planning Committee, we have the school budget broken down into 4 factors. One are general education costs. And by policy, we assume that every year those will go up by 3.5%. We add on to that 3.5% growth, however much growth we've seen from enrollment from the previous year. So in FY18, again, if you look under that recap number, about a third of the way down the page, there's a number that corresponds to growth factor. That number is $1.1 million, $1,133,000. That $1 million is then added to the previous year's base of $38 million to get you to $42 million. Those of you who are good at math will know that 38 plus 1 is not 42.
Good. Sure.
And the reason there's an even bigger number there is, well, there are 2 reasons. One, we added $1.3 million to account for the cost of operating the newly opened Gibbs School, which will open this fall. And we know from the school department that there are associated costs with operating a new building, so those have been built in for FY19. The other thing that is reflected in here is that, as I mentioned, we got more state aid in Chapter 70 than we originally anticipated. And the increase in that state aid, which is about $214,000 over what we originally thought was going to come, we put into the school budget. So that's reflected in that $42 million base. So that's why you see under general education, there's about a 10% increase from one year to the next. The next line is just a straight from year to year increase of 7% in estimated special education costs. The third line is a kindergarten offset fee that went into place about 5 or 6 years ago when the school department went to full year kindergarten. The schools department stopped collecting a fee for a half-day kindergarten. The town got more state aid under Chapter 70 because you get state aid for full-day kindergarten program. And so this was just built in to offset what the school department had lost in those fees at that point. And then again, there's a growth factor for the current year's enrollment that it gets you to a total budget of $66 million. And just if you are curious, the enrollment numbers, the actual enrollment numbers for the last 2 years are at the bottom of the page, and then there are estimates going forward. So that means the school budget is going up $5.1 million, almost $5.2 million, which is about an 8.5% increase overall, really driven a lot by enrollment and because of GIPS. The next area is Minuteman. That's an assessment we get, as you all know, from the Minuteman Vocational High School, and the vast majority of that increase is all related to the debt costs that we have for debt service on their building their new school there. The operating side of it is less than a 1% increase. The vast majority of it is all related to new debt costs. Those debt costs are reflected there in that line, and they're also reflected up above in the property tax line because it's excluded debt. So for every dollar that Minuteman assesses us, it's offset by what we are increasing our estimate for property taxes because we exclude that. And so it's a one-for-one dollar swap. The town side is made up of 3 lines: personnel costs, expenses, and then offsets or transfers from other funds. We do transfer funds from outside of the general fund. Most of it comes from the water and sewer fund, but there are some other funds that we use, like a cemetery fund from time to time to offset costs for the cemetery portion of DPW, for example. And so overall, the Long-Range Planning Committee's guidelines for the town budget is that that net number increased no more than 3.25% every year. And in fact, you can see this year it's increasing by 3.23%. We have about a gap of about $6,000 between 3.23 and 3.25. So the town side, the municipal side budget is coming in under those guidelines. There's a shift and an added amount of taxes over and above the regular 2.5 amount for an MWRA shift, that we can put a portion of what MWRA assesses to the town for the capital costs that they have incurred over the years to build out things like Deer Island. That goes on the water and that doesn't go on the water and sewer bill, but goes on the tax bill. It increases people's taxes. It means that the extent, and it needs to be more significant perhaps, that people could deduct that fully from their federal taxes. They had that offset. But that's what that number is and doesn't change from year to year. The capital budget has 4 lines that lead to a total. The important thing is that that total is 5% of the budget. So all those other lines for existing debt and how much cash we spend on capital and what we use from other sources, other funds, to pay for some of that capital, all comes out through the very careful work of Charlie Foskett and the Capital Planning Committee every year to make sure that hits 5%, and that just rolls forward from year to year. Pensions, as Adam mentioned, are an assessment that we get. Over the long run, we have an agreement with the pension board, the retirement board, that increases will be on average 5.5% per year, but that can vary from year to year depending on whether or not there are more enrollees, in other words, more people who have been hired who are eligible for pensions, and if they need to make changes because of changes in performance of their portfolio. So it does, over the long run, come out to 5.5%, but from year to year it can vary some. Insurance is health insurance mostly. This is one of the numbers on this sheet that I did have a couple of weeks ago when I talked to some of you about this, but is a number that I will guarantee you that by the end of this week will change. The reason it's going to change is that the GIC just voted, the Group Insurance Commission just voted its final rates for the year. Our HR department is going through an analysis of matching who has signed up for which type of insurance with what those new rates are and what the split, whether it's 75-25 or 80-20 per person. It's a complicated exercise and you want to make sure you get it right, so they're taking a few days. I expect by the end of the week we will have final numbers from them, and although I don't know exactly how this number is going to change, I expect it will go down because the GIC's rates were actually fairly modest this year. State assessments, state gives us state aid, and they also take back money from us, most particularly from the MBTA assessment, but a few other things like charter schools and choice, mostly charter schools. Overlay, we have to set aside a certain amount every year in order to give people back money if they think that if they filed for an abatement on their taxes. Reserve fund is 1% of the budget of revenue. Court judgments and Sims, the town is still paying off some debt for acquiring the Sims property a few years ago. That will go away in a couple of years. And so that will then just get down to a very minimum number going forward. And then warrant articles. There's sort of a potpourri of different things that are on the warrant that don't fit in the town budget or the school budget or the capital budget. Things like town day money or parades or flags on veterans' graves and so forth that show up in the warrant. The biggest number here is the amount that we put aside for OPEB from year to year. That's that. And then the override stabilization fund in the years where we've been able to put money aside, as we did last year, we put $211,000 in the override stabilization fund. But there's zero on that going forward. You can see the balances of all these funds at the bottom of the page, free cash, how much we have in a stabilization fund, how much is going to be in the override stabilization fund. And then the really important number is balance. So every year we want to have that number be a zero because we want to be in balance, have ongoing revenues and ongoing expenses match each other. But you can see starting in 2021, those numbers are in parentheses, which means, and on my computer where it's in color, they're in red, big, ugly red numbers, which means there's a deficit. In other words, we'd be spending more than we have resources to support. 2021, that's a deficit of $663,000, but then it very quickly accelerates after that to a $16 million and a $19 million deficit. And that's why, in a minute, we'll start talking about what an override might look like in the future. At this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions about these numbers. And again, I promise they will change in a few days.
Okay, we'll go Mr. Foskett, Mr. Hayner, Mr. Tosti.
So Sandy, the MWRA debt shift, in the light of the recent tax changes, does that still have the same value it did to the town and to the taxpayers, and is that something the selectmen should be looking at with respect to how that's allocated? Because it's a flat levy on all the taxpayers, and water consumption is actually different for different people and different businesses.
That's right.
And it might not be justified to do that anymore.
I think it is something worth looking at. You're right, because of the tax changes, it brings it into sort of stark contrast that it doesn't have as much of an effect as it used to. And it's certainly something that deserves some conversation.
And I can say that we actually included that in our goals this year to specifically look at that. We've discussed it several times at board meetings. Asked that it be looked at in conjunction with the development of the rates with an eye towards rolling that off. It does seem to be outdated. I think my colleague, Mr. Dunn, has something to add.
Yeah, I should say that my goal is to have a plan to roll that down and set that plan this summer with the water rates. I mean, I'm 1 of 5, right? But that's my target.
And I'm 2 of 5, so I think we're pretty close. Careful.
Is that what the plan is saying?
What's the open meeting?
This is a posted meeting.
Oh, it's a posted meeting.
It's a posted meeting. Here to talk about
It is a
Okay.
posted meeting. Call the vote. It is a posted meeting.
All right. Mr. Hayner, you had a question?
The Chapter 70 money, that's partly based on the amount of students we have in the town, is that correct?
That is correct.
Do we get credit for the students from Arlington at Minuteman? Or is that
Minuteman gets credit for the students at Minuteman in their Chapter 70. They split it out.
So we don't see any of that?
It goes directly to Minuteman.
Thank you.
Lower assessment.
Pardon me?
Well, it goes into the whole budget, so we do see assessment.
Right.
I
To
understand.
the extent they have more Chapter 70, they need to assess us less.
They control it, not us, not the town. That's all I'm looking for. Thank you.
Mr. Tosti.
Is in the exempt debt, we went out for a substantial bond issue in November. Is that the exempt debt in this calculation? It doesn't look like it is.
All of the debt that is currently been sold is in this plan, and I'd be glad to provide the backup.
It was what, 34 million, Dean?
Oh.
Over 30 years.
I think Mr. Foskett has an answer to that.
I think, Alan, I think that a lot of the debt is you know, a lot of the school expenditures that we have are paid by the MSBA at the time that we go out. So we're only borrowing net numbers. We're not borrowing gross school expenditures.
Well, with the Gibbs was 24 million, all by itself, without any MSBA money. If you spread that over 30 years plus interest, that alone would probably be more than.
But that may be banned. It may not have. No.
No. So Thompson, just so we're on the same page. So the Gibbs, which I think is 25 million, the Thompson, which is an exact project, which is 4 million, and the high school, which is exempted for $1 million, were all bonded in November. So we can take a look at how that number goes, but everything at this point is, anything that's an exempt borrowing has been borrowed up to and including all available money on the elementary school rebuild, which got borrowed in November of 16 when we finished off the Stratton borrowing.
The reason I raise it is the exempt, obviously exempt debt is going to be going up. I don't want to see the exempt debt drop like a stone next year and then take off like a rocket the year after that. If we can, we should be leveling that off. And now I understand there's some Minuteman debt service that's in there also, but that's only $500,000 or $600,000. So I'd like to see if that really, if the new bond issue is in there.
All right, I'll be glad to follow up with you on that.
Okay.
I want to acknowledge that Alan Jones, Vice Chair of the Finance Committee, has joined us. I think, Senator, you had a question or comment?
Just of the special ed cost, do you have a breakdown of that, of what's transportation, what's,
So within this plan, this is just a straight 7% calculation of an estimate that was made years ago. The actual numbers, some years are higher or lower than that 7%. But I would point to that end of the table to ask for that breakdown.
Transportation costs, special ed transportation.
I'm not sure off the top of my head. I'd have to get back to you. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions or comments on Mr. Schlichter?
Have we looked at what might precipitate further growth in terms of the planning department, looking at what proposals we might have as that either through zoning or planning that would increase growth, that would have a positive revenue impact?
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I will. So we have started the discussion of starting what could be called a build-out analysis that mixed-use zoning changes that passed 2 years ago would allow. So looking sort of parcel by parcel along the commercial corridors to get a sense of that. We started with sort of like a case test to see what type of impact there would be. So the parcel that's being developed on Summer Street, the Campobasso property across from the rink, very much estimates. We looked at that being about a $30,000 or $40,000 incremental tax increase once that property is developed, and that was 2 commercial storefronts and I believe 5 or 6 units above. So you know, maybe that could be a general sort of mixed-use type development. So I was actually, you know, when you really look at it, it wasn't as impressive as I had hoped that a mixed-use development one by one could be. But you know, if you start to line up that, that there was 2 or 3 a year, that could be a significant buoy to our new growth. But the more detailed answer is still being developed.
Have any other questions or comments on this one presented? So I think that provides a good segue to the next item on the agenda. I mean, obviously the long-range financial projection is used for us to get a bit of a temperature of the town, but also to see where we are against our plan. As was laid out, we have nearly tripled the lifespan of the last override with the contributions of our employees, generosity of our taxpayers, and with the fiscal management of the folks around this table, and others. However, good things don't last forever, and as we see, we are facing a cliff, and barring an absolutely draconian and untenable cut in the level of service that this town and our school department provides, we are going to have to start talking about scenarios around a general override. We have in the past, as I think everyone here knows, gone out to the voters on 5-year timetables. We've gone out to the voters on 3-year timetables. We have several scenarios that have been worked up here, and I don't know if the manager or the deputy town manager wanted to speak to the scenarios that have been provided to us and as a basis of discussion.
Good. Thank you. So I think the dialogue is what's most important, so I'll go over this pretty quickly. And just to build on what Joe just said, there's been a lot of talk at the Long Range Planning Committee about the pros and cons of asking for an operating override a year earlier than it's absolutely necessary. And that might initially seem counterintuitive to ask for taxpayer resources before they're needed, but the real genesis of that is by asking a year earlier, the amount of the override is dramatically lower. And these assessments or this analysis will show that. So on the first page, you look at the sheet starting with baseline, that's the front page. Here are 3 different scenarios that assume that the override would be asked for basically about a year from now, or maybe June of calendar year 2019, to go into effect in fiscal year 20. So the first scenario says that for an override, based on the numbers as we know them today, if it was going to be asked for next year, a $5.5 million override would last 3 years, and the average single-family tax impact would be $373. If you go down to 4-year override, you see that the amount of the override would go up to $8.7 million, last for 4 years, and the average single-family tax impact would be $592. And then correspondingly down to the 5-year option, $11.3 million, 5 years, $767. Now, if you flip the sheet over, these 3 scenarios outline asking for that, an override 1 year later. So in calendar year 2020, for an override to go into effect for fiscal year 21. So you'll just shift over a column in the FY21 column, and you see it's $11.8 million to last 3 years, an $800 tax impact on the average household, average single family. 4 years, $14.3 million, $973 impact. And then 5-year override, $16.7 million, and over $1,000, $1,100 average single-family taxpayer impact. So that, I think, quite clearly demonstrates why there's been so much discussion about asking for it earlier, based on the sheer magnitude of both the amount of the override and the taxpayer impact. Also, we should all be cognizant of, as we're talking about this, below those three projections, you see estimated high school debt impacts. As I think we all know, we're in the early stages or in the middle stages of the feasibility study for the high school. So we're just beginning to approach a time where we're going to have some sense of what the high school might potentially be able to look like and what it might cost. So we're still dealing very much in looking at what other schools of a similar size in the state have been projected to cost, and then making some reasonable or responsible cost assumptions based on that. But that said, if you look at that chart, if you assume that the town's share would be associated with estimated cost, that's not the estimated cost of the project, that would be the town share. So the MSBA will, rough numbers, we would probably get somewhere around 45% reimbursement, but then some things would ultimately not be reimbursable, so the effective rate would probably drop down to somewhere between the 35 and 40% range. So just to give a range, if our share was $100 million, the annual single-family tax impact would be $392. If our share was $125, correspondingly, you can see it would be $490. And if our share was $150 million, you can see that it would be $588. When we are nearly certainly going to be needing to ask for the debt exclusion for the high school is next spring. or early summer of 2019. So what this sort of lays out is the possibility for the town considering asking for an override and a debt exclusion in the same year, or asking for a debt exclusion and then an override in back-to-back years. And these are at least starting point numbers to get this group's head around, what the impacts would be and what the ask would be from the taxpayers. So that's the rough sketch, and happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Hayner. First, I would like to state the seniors' debt exclusion and override have no impact. They're the same things for us because we're not going to outlive the debt. Just want to make that clear up front. Asking this, when we go out for a school, we have to, the town, correct me if I'm wrong, do we have to bond for the full amount of the building? Does that have an impact on the tax? In other words, if our part of the bill is $100 million, and say we're fortunate enough to, it's another $60 million, it's a $160 million project, do we have to, am I paying taxes on the $160 million or just the part that we're going to have to pay?
Just the part that you have to pay. We have to vote a bond authorization for the entire amount to comply with the MSBA regulations, but we'll only ever borrow the amount that we have to pay.
That's a question that I've been asked by a lot of seniors.
Yes, it's a good question.
Thank you.
Mr. Foskett.
Adam, if you look at on your 5-year plan, fiscal year 21, it looks like the tax rate, if I read this right, the taxes raised rather is about $128 million, right? $127,975,000.
Yes. Yeah, sorry.
So in the past, the towns had overrides that were roughly 10%. Is that a?
I think that that is near to accurate. Yes.
Yeah. So that would be about $1,200 average tax impact. Did I say that right? No.
12.
It would be 12 million. So it was somewhere, if you look on the second page, the fiscal 21 impact would be somewhere between 11.8 million and 14.3 million. Somewhere between the 3 and the 4.
Yep, that's accurate.
Or alternatively, if we looked at the prior case, it would be 5 years at 11 point. Now the taxes are a little lower that year, but somewhere, I think we're somewhere around 4 or 5 years if we stuck to the 10% impact.
Correct.
Right. Correct. Which is a metric that the voters have accepted in the past, and generally speaking, the town has carried the, deployed the benefits of the override beyond the projected limits.
Thank you. Anyone else have any other questions or comments? Yeah, Mr. Schleckman.
Yeah, on the calculations that we have the average single-family tax impact, what's the value of a single-family home that we're using to calculate that?
The average assessed value per the assessor's numbers right now is $655,000. So as we know, sometimes the average is an average, right? So there's certainly a lot of condominiums in one part of town that are below that number, and a lot of single-family homes in one part of town that are above that number. But that, and we could run a mean, we could run a median, but the average, as it's calculated, the average is
so that if we're at, depending on what your value is relative to that number, you can get a comparison.
Yeah, and we can produce documents that, instead of showing this, or in addition to just showing the average single family, we can show the tax rate impact, so residents could do the calculation themselves as they come.
It's a reasonable number to come off with, knowing something about the real estate market. Maybe it's a little low, but just having that number on the sheet's helpful, so you can back it out. I'm not really going to talk about which method I prefer, because they're all valid, but just having that number there as a benchmark is helpful. Any idea if Mr. Rogers, if there's going to be any local option revenues in the future, or possibly what the impact on local aid would be if the millionaire tax passes?
Well, the total estimated annual additional revenue to the state is $2 billion. The money is supposed to be earmarked for two things, education and transportation. That's being litigated in front of the Supreme Judicial Court because there's a group that's arguing that, among other arguments in their brief, that specific expenditures are the province of the legislature. So the ballot question can't mandate how the appropriators spend the money. So, but I'm confident even if that were litigated such that it can go on the ballot but can't be directed to education and transportation, a huge percentage of it will go for education.
So there's separability in the initial question. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So the whole thrust of it is to provide additional revenue for education. But specifically how that would impact Arlington, I could get out a calculator and try to crunch some data. I can't say right now. But it would lead to a boost in state aid for education that was likely substantial.
I think the manager has something to add.
Yeah, I mean, just and to round out this conversation, I think we're in a place where there's certainly opportunity pending the outcome of that ballot question and that SJC case, but there's also a lot of risk given that there's also a ballot question to reduce the sales tax, which wouldn't reduce it by a corresponding amount, but by a significant amount, such that even if this measure passed, we could be near a status quo revenue place. So there's a lot, I think, in the next year to play out in terms of what the future of local aid and transportation aid holds.
Mr. Dunn and Mr. Thielman. Yeah.
So two thoughts, and I welcome feedback on both of them. One is that the Long Range Planning Committee, one of the themes we've been talking about is talking about these scenarios and talking about what dates to pick. And I have definitely been persuaded that it makes sense to put the override on the same date, on the same ballot as the high school and debt exclusion. And the big argument that carries the day for that is the number of volunteers that it takes or politically to run an override campaign, and spinning them up on consecutive years seems like a very bad idea and not feasible, whereas spinning them up all at once. And so to me, that means that setting this based on the current plan about when we would be able to put the high school on the ballot, that's talking about the 2019 scenarios. And so if anyone has any feedback, particularly negative feedback on that, I'm interested. But I have a second point which I wanted to make, which is these numbers, these projections, are all built on the same percentages that we've been using for the last several years. And in particular, that means some of the things that were negotiated 6 years ago, including like the 3%, the 7%, some things that were interim negotiated, like the new student growth adjustments. And I think I've been trying to, I don't have a good answer for this, and I really am interested in what people think about how to set what that, when we go to the voters, what should the number be, and what are voter expectations about what they're going to get. I have gotten advice from more than one school committee member, for instance, that we should be aggressive and that we should try to increase the percentages that we're delivering to the school budget in order to deliver the education that many of the school committee members who speak to me about this would like. Then I could certainly get feedback from others who say, Dan, taxes in this town are high and they're going higher and you should try to stop that. And my answer to both of them is that we're talking about a basket of revenue and a basket of services, and you can construct different baskets, then you talk to the voters about which ones you want. But I guess this is a very long-winded way of saying, what should the promise, how do we go about deciding what the promises we want to make to voters with this, hypothetical, or not even hypothetical, this 2019 tax override?
Thank you. I've got Mr. Thielman, Ms. Mahan, Ms. Rowe, and then we'll come back to Mr. Hayter for a second turn.
Well, so my question is that somewhat similar to Dan's comment, which is, I'm wondering what the process is going to be to determine the override amount, because in the past couple of 2005 and 2011, I believe the number was a 10% increase in property tax. Is that what everybody else? So I would love to see a process where we don't just rush to this 10% number because we've done it in the past, but we have a set of metrics that we use to determine what the right number is. And I'm wondering how we do that. And I'm wondering if there's been any thought on how that's been done. And that's kind of the question we're raising for the group. So that was, I don't know if you've thought about this, but I'm wondering what the process is going to be to determine the amount, because I think it should be done with lots of input from lots of groups. The school committee, the board of selectmen, town meeting members, voters. I think there should be a lot of dialogue and input from people on what the right number is. And it should be based on, and I think voters should be presented with what services you get and how much they cost. And then we make a decision, and you guys, the board of selectmen, put a question for the voters based on that dialogue. So I'm just wondering if any thoughts have been given to the process by which we come up with a number.
So can I take a quick crack at that? Sure. So I think part of, and I don't want to speak for individual members of the long-range planning committee, but I think the goal was to come here tonight and talk to a broader audience of stakeholders about this concept, see if there was, not that votes will be taken, but that there was general consensus or buy-in to approach it this way before we rolled out a public information or public consensus campaign. Yeah. With, given the risk that we could have come here tonight and had everybody who's not on the long-range planning committee tell us we're crazy and to go come up with another idea. So I think if there is a consensus or feeling of let's move this to the next step, this group would be asking the long-range planning committee to go back, work on a plan, communicate with the school committee, the board of selectmen, and then probably have a budget and revenue task force meeting within the next couple months to flesh that out a little bit more, to start to engage the public.
So moved.
So, okay, just taking a time check here. We're at 10 minutes to 7, just so you know. There are a few people who haven't spoken yet, so I want to take them first. Ms. Mahan, then Ms. Rowe, and then Ms. Starks, and then we'll go around second round.
I just want to put something on the table, and maybe I should have posed this question before. I don't know if the town manager and I should have done it, but Senator Friedman is here, or if Representative Rogers. I've been reading somewhere that the state, the Foundation Budget Review Committee had met, and I'm hearing that recommendations came out. So not that we have to, because I am cognizant of the time, I guess I would ask through the chair to the town manager and our legislative delegation, unless somebody knows a quick answer, what those recommendations came out of that Foundation Review Committee and which ones Arlington, working with our legislative delegation, really should be honing in on vis-a-vis anything we can do to help with the budget. So when we go to the voters and say, we've tried everything, we've done everything. And from my sense from that State House committee, that was basically a legit committee and is coming out with some solid recommendations. So maybe that's a topic for a future budget and revenue task force meeting, if we could see the recommendations of that Foundation Budget Review Committee, and then talk about which ones we hope to implement and if and when we can get it done. So maybe not an answer to that, maybe just is that a future?
Absolutely, and just one small brief answer. Sandy mentioned that part of the Chapter 70 calculation this year took into account the actual cost or more actual cost of teachers' health insurance, and that is one piece of the Foundation Budget Review Commission's recommendations. There are more pieces that would mean more money to the town, but we can certainly talk about it.
So not tonight, because we have 8.5 minutes now. Thank you. Unless somebody wants.
Unless anyone has a quick answer.
Well, I mean, the commission found that the foundation budget has not been adjusted in a long time, and indeed is dramatically underfunded, which is the big argument for the fair share amendment that has been discussed. So I'm happy to, if you have a separate meeting, come and talk in more detail about it. But that was the thrust of the finding.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just, Cindy, Senator Friedman had to go because her husband just got 2 new knees today.
Oh, wow.
But she also said, and I will send her an email later, get in touch with Adam about any, because I think Dave's right, but I think there are future actions. I just want to say, as an outsider coming in anew, that I think you definitely need to put them both together. I believe Mrs. Starks and I have been involved in the last couple of overrides, debt exclusions. We have a bulk of very young, committed families, and I think that that's how we get any kind of increase through. They are an incredibly committed bunch of people who will do anything for this town. On the other side, there are older people like myself and this man I'm sitting next to who's a little younger than me, who are very concerned about our tax rates. So how to really balance that is, I don't know that the young families are as concerned about the older people and their tax rates as I am.
Ms. Starks, and then, I guess, Mr. Tosti, and then we'll hear from others.
So I want to, I believe as well that if the high school has to go on the ballot in 2019, and we're choosing between doing a general override 2019 and 2020, that we have to do it at the same time, because I believe that it would fail in 2020, knowing that everyone just raised their taxes, because again, most people can't suss this out, right? So I think you either have to do it all at once and kind of sell it as a package, even though I know it has to be two different ballot questions. But I really feel like having voted one override in 19, the reality is that a lot of people who are confused or don't understand it, it becomes really hard to then ask for another one the next year. So I really think that you do have to do it both the same year. Also, from the school's point of view, one thing I would really like to do, and I don't know how doable this is, so I'm speaking off the cuff without having actually talked to the people who have to do this work. But one of the things that we've been talking about on the school committee for a long time, and I feel like this really makes that happen, is that we really owe it to everybody to go home and do the work that says, this is how much money we need. Instead of playing this, here's 6% more, how's that this year? And every year we have the discussion about how it's still not enough money. And we kind of do this because that's always the way we've done it, right? And I really feel like what we owe the town is to say, okay, not that if we could have everything, not if we had the pie in the sky, but if we went through all of what we've just done, because we're now in that budget cycle, if we were to roll that forward and add in the things that we really feel like we have to have, what is that real number? And then somehow work that into some kind of formula that we can use to generate a per student number that we think is real. So we don't have to have all of these, well, and then we add in kindergarten, and then we add in, per pupil, and then we add in, just come out with an actual number. And I don't know how realistic that is, but I feel like part of doing this as we move forward is that we owe that number too. Because we could give that number, I do believe.
I'm trying to get folks up and spoken.
Yep.
Mr. Tosti?
Just quickly, I think the long-range formula numbers have been very fair and flexible to new things. As somebody, and I'm really concerned about the joy of victory and the agony of defeat. If this thing goes down the tubes, pain and blood will flow. And it's not just the senior citizens who are going to be worried. As somebody who's been in the real estate market recently, young couples are coming in here and buying houses for $700,000, $800,000, $900,000, and when they get their first mortgage payment, they're going to be worried about their taxes also. So it's just not other people. So I think we really need to decide on, and I guess really asking the selectmen as sort of our main policy makers to really think, what can the people absorb? And we might just have to limit some of our expectations.
Thank you, Mr. Tosti. We've got a few minutes left, so a few people want to speak a second time. Mr. Hanna?
I just wanted to say, I agreement with Jeff and Dan, and what Cindy just said, we have to know where every penny and dollar is going to go. The minimum cost listed was $765. That's what the high school and the 10-year plan on the first, do it next year. Seniors, when they know what they're getting for their dollar, will spend the buck. But going back to what Cindy said, 6%, 7%, They're very wary. If we do split it, I agree. In Lexington, they put it together, this is several years ago, two things, a school thing and a couple of town things, with no explanation, and it failed. We can't afford it to let it fail.
Thank you. Mr. Carmen had something to wonder.
Yeah, so one thing I just want to, when we look at these 3 or 4 year, 5 year scenarios for people to think about, and I know what I'm about to say feels like surreal, especially as a parent of elementary school kids who sees these large cohorts showing up, is the last demographic study we did has enrollment peaking. It's not going to just go up forever. It's not mathematically possible. Enrollment is supposed to peak in the 2023-2024 school year. Now, whether it actually goes down or stays level at like 500-600 kids a year coming in is still to be seen. But when we think about, one thing to think about with these different scenarios is two of them don't get you to the crest of enrollment growth, and one of them does. And the reason I point that out as significant is the enrollment growth has been the largest driver of the budget right now. It's the biggest growth going up. So we could find ourselves in a scenario where we pass an override and then 3 years later have to go back with the same story again, even though the story might not be lasting as long. And so I think, besides financial consideration of 3, 4, 5 years, as a town, as a structural budget, we could be in a much different place in 3 years versus 5 years.
Thank you, Mr. Carmen. So we are at 7, just so you know, the board is going into our meeting at 7:15, so I'll take Mr. Foskett and Mr. Schlickman, who had their hands up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the risk of being an outlier here, I'd like to go back to my 10% number. We all have to live on fixed incomes and fixed budgets, and the taxpayers are not an ATM machine that we can just sort of ring up and take more money from them at will. Despite all of the things that we might like to have. I'd like to have a new car, and a few other things, vacation home, etc. But if I can't afford it, I don't get it. If we have a 10, and I was suggesting that 10% is an upper limit on this conceptual override. If we have the override and the school in the same, and the debt exclusion for the school in the same year, that's going to be roughly a 15% tax increase. That's a big number. That's probably bigger than any other city or town has had in eastern Massachusetts in the last 10 years. So I think we should think long and hard about how much we're willing to push the voters on this issue.
Thank you.
And I don't know the answer to this question, but it was posed, what do we see happening? And the town is changing, radically, in my view. And at the school committee, we're starting to get parents coming in with pitchforks, not about maintaining status quo. That's not good enough for them. They want to know what we are going to do to improve services, improve the quality, reduce class size, to provide more services for their children. So that is a drastic change from a large demographic group who bought expensive houses with the expectation that the value of the services, the schools that are associated with them will improve. And so I don't know how to calculate that out in terms of funding or political impact of that group coming out supporting a debt exclusion and override. But it feels, from my point of view as a school committee member and the people who seek me out, to be a large and different component of this community than we're used to in past overrides.
Thank you very much. This has been a really rich, enlightening discussion. And thank you to the manager and the deputy manager also. Could I have a motion to adjourn? So moved. All those in favor?
Yeah.